Here we are talking about two main characteristics of developing countries. One is level of industrialization and manufactured exports. And the second one is geography and natural resource endowments. Let's have a look at it. Level of industrialization and manufactured exports. So you'll find this that industrialization is related with modernization. With industrialization, more economic power comes. You look at many of the developing countries also, they have prioritized industrialization. They said this, that fine, I mean, we will work on industrialization. For example, East Asian economies. Whatever manufacturing is there in the developing countries is mainly concentrated in the low skill and the low wage jobs. Many of the developing countries, they're still dependent upon the agriculture. In some of the cases, even 2 by 3rd of the population is dependent upon agriculture. While in the developed countries, only 1 to 2% of the population is dependent upon agriculture. Developing countries, if you look at them, you will find this, that they are more dependent on agriculture compared to industry and services. Take up the case of Madagascar. 82% of the population is employed in agriculture, but it contributes only 25% of the total output. In Indonesia, 41% of the population is engaged in agriculture, but it contributes to only 14% of the total output. In agriculture also, you'll find this, that there is a lot of variability in employment. So more women are employed in agriculture in Asia and Africa, while more men are employed in agriculture in Latin America, particularly in the developing countries. In the developed countries, you will find this, that many of the manufacturing sector jobs, they're the high-skilled jobs, they're the high-paying jobs. But if you look at the industrial employment, you look at the employment in the industrial sector in the developing countries, what you will find is that, these are the low industrial employment for both men and women. And the other important point is that developing countries are still dependent upon the primary goods exports, agricultural exports, mineral exports. Although some of the countries, some of the developing countries, they've also started exporting manufactured goods, but many of the low-income African nations are still dependent upon the agricultural exports and mineral exports, right? Another characteristic of developing countries is geography and natural resource endowment. So understand one thing, geography can affect public health. So many of the developing countries are coming from the tropical or the subtropical climate. So in these climates, there are more chances of malaria. There are more chances of tropical pests. There are water constraints. There are extreme heat situations, right? So geography can influence public health. Geography can influence development also. There are examples that there are various landlocked countries which are not that developed as compared to coastal economies. There are examples where geography can also affect agriculture, right? So, for example, Green Revolution benefits were not they were not spread out to sub-Saharan Africa. Then, due to climate change, also there can be countries which are going to be very negatively impacted, and many of these are the developing countries of Asia and South Asia. Sorry, of South Asia and Africa. You also have to remember that there are differences between the natural resource endowments within these, among these developing countries. For example, on the one hand, you have the oil Persian Gulf states, Middle East countries, very rich in oil. And then on the other hand, you have resource poor countries like Chad, like Yemen, like Haiti. But you also have an example where you can have a very resource rich state. For example, Democratic Republic of Congo, but it is not very developed. So just because you have resources, it is not a guarantee for development. What is also often seen is that resource wealth can also lead to conflict. It can lead to inequality. It can lead to undemocratic governance. All of that can happen. That is also seen. But you know what? At the end, they say that geography is not destiny. Singapore might have a very challenging geography, but it is one of the very successful economies. Let us talk about the other characteristics of developing countries. So we have talked about few of the features. Now let us talk about the other one. So what are those? One, I think this is sixth number or so. So I'm just putting a number 6 here. Level of industrialization. level of industrialization and manufactured exports. Level of industrialization and manufactured exports. Right. You have to understand one thing, that here, when you talk about industrialized countries, so what are these industrialized countries? These are the advanced economies. They have gained high productivity with the industrialization. So as industrialization progressed, there was the higher productivity. And this became a very important factor in their economic power. So they gained economic power because of this industrialization. So one thing is that. So these are industrialized countries. Right. These are industrialized countries. And with industrialization, what happened is that there is bound to be higher productivity and higher incomes. And economic power also get associated with that. So high productivity and incomes are associated with with industrialization. With industrialization. And this is the main factor in modernization. This is the main factor in gaining their economic power. So these industrialized countries, they gain economic power because of industrialization. So it was a key factor in modernization. And economic power. And economic power. Right. You look at various developing countries, what you will find is that they also prioritize industrialization. The main examples are the countries in East Asia, right? And they increase their manufactured shares. I mean, their shares in the manufacturing sector in their national income. So the shares of the manufacturing sector in East Asian economies, it increased. And because of that, industrialization increased. Because of that, modernization occurred. Because of that, they experienced economic power, right? So many developing countries prioritize industrialization, right? For example, East Asian economies. Shares of manufacturing sector in GDP increased for several this middle income countries or upper middle income countries. So you can say lower middle income countries and upper middle income countries. Achha, what happened also is that their manufacturing is concentrated mainly in the low skill products, lower wage activities. So the manufacturing in the lower middle income countries and the upper middle income countries, it is going to be different as compared to the developed countries. Here in the lower middle income countries and the upper middle income countries, the main activities which are taken up, they are lower skill activities and they are lower wage activities. You have to understand that why would world want manufacturing should occur in these lower income countries? Because they will have to give lower wages in these countries, right? So manufacturing. Often concentrated in lower skill and lower wage activities, right? Then the another related point to this is that in many of the developing countries, you will also find that most of the population is engaged in agriculture, right? In lower income countries, even 2/3 of the population can be engaged in agriculture. In my own country, more than 50% of people are engaged in agriculture. While if you compare it with the developed countries, you will find this that only there 1 to 2% of the population is engaged in agriculture, right? Uh, Developing countries have higher employment and output in agriculture, right? So in lower income countries, you will find this that sometimes even 2/3 of the population is engaged in agriculture, which may not be true in the developed countries. In developed countries, only 1 to 2% of the population is maybe engaged in agriculture, right? So you can write share of population engaged in agriculture in developing countries. In some cases, 2/3 of the population, right? 2/3 of the population is engaged in agriculture, while in developed countries, 1% to 2% of the population is engaged in agriculture, right? 1% to 2% of the population is engaged in agriculture in the developed countries, right? Okay. Then you have in developing countries, what you will also find is that um, most of the population is engaged in agriculture. But the productivity is also very low in agriculture as compared to their own industrial and the services sector, right? So you just compare Madagascar's case. So in Madagascar, what happened was that 82% of the population is engaged in agriculture, while it contributes to only 25% of the output. Indonesia, 41% of the people are engaged in agriculture, but they contribute to only 14% of the total output. Right? Developing countries have lower productivity. In agriculture compared to industry and services. So we'll take up two examples. So you can say, just write employment in agriculture. Contribution to total output. By agriculture. So you can take up a case of Madagascar. And you can also take up the case of Indonesia. In Madagascar, 82% of the population is engaged in agriculture, but agriculture contributes only 14% of the total output, right? In Indonesia, 41% of the population is agriculture, not 14%. I think it is 25%. I'm sorry. And here it is 14% of contribution to the total output by agricultural sector, right? Now, the another important point about this this thing was, even within agriculture, you will find a lot of gender differences in agriculture. So there are more proportion of population. See, you can say proportion of population is going to vary in agriculture from country to country. So there are countries, for example, in Latin America, more men are employed in agriculture. In Africa and Asia, more women are employed in agriculture. Gender differences. Gender differences in agriculture. So you can say that proportion of women in agriculture varies globally. For example, In Latin America, there are more men in agriculture. In Africa and Asia, more women in agriculture, right? In Africa and Asia, more women in agriculture, right? Then the another feature within this broad feature is developed countries. If you look at the development of the developed countries, you will see that they move from agriculture, then they move to industry, and then they move to services, right? So there's a shift from industry to services which is happening in the developed countries. And the kind of the jobs which are there in the developed countries in the industrial sector, they're the high skilled jobs, the high manufacturing jobs, they're the high income jobs. This is completely opposite of what is happening in the industrial sector in the developing countries, which are low skilled, low wage jobs. You look at Africa, for example, uh, the employment in the industrial sector is low for both men and women. Also, export oriented jobs, they're also less than 2% of the employment, right? So developed countries show a shift from industry to services. Industrial jobs in developed countries are high skill and high wage jobs. And high wage jobs. Well, if you look at industrial employment in Africa, you will find this that there is low industrial employment for both men and women. For both men and women. And then if you look at it, many of these developing countries, they are dependent upon the primary goods as their main exports. So many have also diversified away from agriculture and minerals. It's not that, but and if you look at some of the middle income countries, they're also exporting the manufactured goods. Even my country is also exporting some of the manufactured goods. Uh, but if you look at the low income countries, particularly in Africa, you will find this that most of these countries are still dependent upon the primary exports. For example, the exports of the agricultural goods, exports of the minerals, right? developing countries often rely on primary exports. While many have diversified away from agriculture and minerals. From agriculture and minerals. But many low-income countries particularly in Africa, remain dependent on agriculture and mineral exports. Remain dependent on agricultural and mineral exports. Another characteristic is geography and the natural resource endowments. Geography and natural resource endowments. Right? That is the next characteristic. Now, one of the important point is that as far as geography is concerned, it is going to affect agriculture, which could be a mainstay for many of the developing countries. It can also help in development. For example, in case if there is a coastal economy, then coasts could be developed. It could lead to more tourism and hence development also. And there are various other reasons also that geography can help in development. It can also help in public health. So geography itself can be a crucial factor in public health, in development, in agriculture, right? So geography. Influences agriculture, public health, and development. You find many of the landlocked countries, they tend to have lower incomes as compared to the coastal countries. So here geography has affected development, right? For example, landlocked economies often in Africa tend to have lower incomes, than coastal economies, tend to have lower incomes than coastal economies, right? If you look at developing countries, they may need tropical or subtropical. And in these economies, there is often tend to be um, more of cases like malaria. There are water constraints. Sometimes there are heat constraints, heat extremes. So all of that can also affect public health. So these are the examples how geography can influence public health, how geography can influence development, how geography can influence agriculture, right? Developing countries are often tropical or subtropical. They suffer from tropical pests, diseases like malaria, water constraints, and heat extremes. And heat extremes. So they say this that green revolution, as it has benefited the other parts of even the developing world, but due to heat extremes, due to various kinds of tropical diseases in sub-Saharan Africa, this green revolution benefits, they could not be spread out in that part of the country because of geography, right? Efforts to spread green revolution benefits. Green revolution benefits. And control tropical diseases in sub-Saharan Africa. Right? Then you also have to see that many of these developing countries, they are and will be impacted by climate change, particularly in the countries in Southeast Asia, right, and Africa. So these countries are impacted and will be impacted by climate change. And particularly in case of the country has very low resource endowments, that is also going to be even more negatively impacted by climate change, right? Greatest. Negative impact. Rejected. For Africa and South Asia. Countries with low resources. Often face significant challenges. Often face significant challenges. And then they say that if you look at resource endowments, even resource endowments are going to be very different from one developing countries to the other developing countries. You have some of the very rich oil resource countries in Middle East. And on the other hand, you have very resource poor countries like Chad, like Yemen, like Haiti. So there are differences. So guys, you have to remember this, that the question will come like, are these developing countries homogeneous set of countries or heterogeneous set of countries? So all of these are the examples of, there are some common characteristics which are flowing through all of these countries. But again, there are differences among various developing countries also. And these are the different examples for each of them. That is what you have to give. You can't just give a generalistic answer, right? You have to write the examples which are there in the reading. Am I clear on that? Right. Natural resource endowments. Endowments vary by country. See, on the one hand, you have oil-rich countries. Right? On the one hand, you have oil-rich Middle East countries. And the other hand, you have resource-poor countries like Chad, Yemen, and Haiti. Uh, you have oil-rich, Persian Gulf states, versus resource-poor countries like Chad, Yemen, Haiti. And you know what? There are countries which are very, very mineral rich. For example, high mineral rich countries like Democratic Republic of Congo. Is that developed? No. So just you having very high, or you're very rich in terms of resource endowments, in terms of minerals, let's say, that is also not going to guarantee development. But high mineral wealth also does not guarantee development. For example, Democratic Republic of Congo. Democratic Republic of Congo. And you know what? If the country is very rich in mineral resources, right? What is also seen is that natural resource wealth can also lead to conflict. It can also lead to inequality. It can also lead to undemocratic governance. So in many of the countries which are very, which are resource rich, you do not have democratic governance in many countries. Uh, there is also often a huge inequality in those countries. There are conflicts in those countries. I mean, the case, for example, is Democratic Republic of Congo, right? Uh, also, resource wealth can lead to conflict, can lead to inequality, it can lead to undemocratic governance. Can lead to all that. It can lead to all this. So, you know what? There are examples uh, which are challenging geography. So they are having development despite of having challenging geography, right? For example, Singapore. But geography is not destiny, right? So Singapore is one of the example. Singapore is one of the successful economies in challenging geography. In challenging geography, right? Huh? Okay.